Well, hello and good evening, and welcome to episode 4 of Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. Now, you may not actually recognize me this evening because I am incognito, because I'm not wearing my usual grey jacket. The reason being is that my grey jackets are in the north of England. They're at Barton Moss, awaiting my return there. But more of that a little later this evening, when hopefully you'll join us for Fracking Nightmare at 9 o'clock. Meanwhile, on episode 4 of the Crane Report, we're going to move on from our last 3 episodes where we were looking at the reframing of British police. And over the coming weeks, we're going to be delving into subjects that you're not likely to see in the mainstream media, or certainly not discussed in the way that we're going to discuss them. And tonight, we're actually going to look at weather wars and look at what perhaps might just be occurring in the UK and elsewhere in the world right now. But before we do that, and before I introduce my guest this evening, I just want to confirm to all the readers and subscribers of Uncensored magazine that they have arrived in the UK some 6 months, oh sorry, 6 months, I wish, 6 weeks late. Here we go. Here is the absolute tangible evidence that the pallet arrived late on Friday afternoon, and we have a team of people packaging them, ready to be distributed tomorrow and Wednesday morning. And with numbers 33 and 34 of Uncensored magazine. And to get your, if you want to subscribe, you can find the website at uncensoredmag.co.uk. And the sister publication, the New Zealand Journal of Natural Medicine, editions 10 and 11 were also on the pallet. So subscribers to these magazines, you're going to have a reading fest, because these will also be in the post later this week. And if you want to subscribe to these truly outstanding magazines, these are the magazines that Big Pharma certainly does not want you to read. You can subscribe to these on the website, which is nznaturalmed.co.uk. Right, more of those magazines perhaps a little bit later. So tonight, weather wars. It can't have escaped anyone's attention that the UK has been experiencing some rather unusual weather, and not least in the southwest of the country, where much of the Somerset levels are basically underwater. And it's not limited to the southwest. This is the southeast. This is the Mole Valley around the Leatherhead area. But the Somerset levels, this is one such property there where the owner has forked out some £5,000 to build a barrier around his property, making the observation that if he waited on central government or even the local authority to do anything, he'd be coming back to a property that was devastated by water. Now, the UK isn't the only country to be experiencing extreme weather. In the northeast of the United States of America and the Midwest, they've been experiencing extreme cold, with temperatures going down to about -40 degrees. Now, I have been in those kind of temperatures when I was in the oil industry up on the North Slope of Alaska, and let me tell you, it's cold. It's extremely cold. The difference being, of course, that in Alaska, people have the clothing for it because they expect those kind of temperatures. In the Midwest and the Northeast of the United States, I doubt whether too many people had the right clothing. In California right now, California is experiencing extreme drought, along, of course, with the Deep South and the Midwest of the Deep South there, around West Texas, where landowners and farmers have been running out of water, and in fact taking the gas companies to court for extracting water from their aquifers and leaving them inadequate supplies even for domestic use, let alone for providing them with their agricultural livelihood. And now we see the same situation in California, where once again the gas companies have been given priority over the private citizen. Of course, we've seen Other areas of the world, like the Philippines, with dealing with horrendous flooding. So something is going on. There's no doubt that the weather is very, very unusual. It is extreme weather. And of course, there are a lot of people who are being perhaps a little bit overly simplistic by simply suggesting that this is directly related to climate change, to anthropogenic climate change. But perhaps there's something else going on here. Because if we look at what is occurring in the Somerset Levels in particular, then a sequence of events over the last decade or so goes way beyond the cock-up theory. It would appear that there has been a deliberate strategy to flood the Somerset Levels and perhaps even other parts of the country. Now, shock, horror and absolute disbelief, this did actually make it into the mainstream media, and it seems that Christopher Booker has been doing some research for himself and looking at the situation. And in his article, which appeared in the Daily Telegraph, actually, in the UK on Saturday, he says, devastating evidence has now come to light. Not just that the floods covering 65 square miles of the Somerset Levels could have been prevented, but that they were deliberately engineered by Labour ministers in 2009. Regardless of the property and human rights of the thousands of people whose homes and livelihoods would be affected. Furthermore, that wildly misleading Met Office forecast in November led the Environment Agency to take a step that has made the flooding infinitely more disastrous than it need have been. It continues, the smoking guns begin with a policy decision announced in 2005 by Labour's Flood Minister Elliot Morley, later to be jailed for fraudulently claiming more than $30,000 on his MP's expenses. Under the heading, Saving Wetland Habitats, More Money for Key Sites, Morley directed that to comply with the EU's Habitats Directive and part EU-funded study involving the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the World Wildlife Foundation and the Environment Agency, flooding in Somerset should be artificially promoted because wildlife will benefit from increased water levels. The 13 local drainage boards responsible for keeping the levels properly managed were all to be co-opted into implementing this policy. Well, it's very interesting to note that a mainstream journalist is actually starting to scratch beneath the surface and draw their own conclusions. And many of those viewing tonight will be familiar with a document that first reared its ugly head 22 years ago, yes, 22 years ago, in 1992, a document known as Agenda 21. The good news is that despite the fact that the document's been pretty much kept under wraps from the vast majority of people for that 22 years, more and more people are now starting to take an interest. And I'm sure we'll be exploring more of that as we go through the evening. Now, I wanted to introduce you to my guest this evening, because my guest is a very interesting gentleman. And I first met with David Lim, I think it was about a year or so ago, where he was giving a presentation on his research into weather manipulation through geoengineering. So who better to join me on the discussion tonight, where we look at weather wars, than David Lim. So David, welcome to Humanity versus Insanity.
Good evening, Ian. How are you?
I'm very well, David. And you're looking very dapper there, my friend.
Well, I thought I'd dress for the occasion. I see you didn't, though.
Well, absolutely, yes. I've dressed down this evening, but there you go. I'm slumming it. I'll scrub up next week. Anyway, David, so your thoughts. In the introduction there, I was sort of giving a very brief introduction to the aspect of weather manipulation and the fact that what's occurred in the Somerset Levels in particular goes way beyond the proverbial cock-up theory. It does look like it was indeed contrived, and it was just a matter of time time before the people of Somerset were effectively condemned to lives of sodden misery. But what are your own thoughts on what's occurring?
Well, interestingly, I and a group of us were at Boroughbridge on the levels. We were reporting from the River Parrett, and we were engaging with the locals there. We stopped at the pub and we spoke to the residents, informing them about what had happened. In particular, the Environmental Agency documents to do with the catchment area. There was one in 2004, making space for water, and then there was one in 2008. And we had a mixed response, Ian, to be fair. Initially, locals were very reticent in getting to grips with this information, and even when you'd actually showed them the documentation itself, they still didn't believe what we were telling them. So after a flurry of media groups had been down there, we bumped into the Sky team down there at the time. We engaged in conversation with them, letting them know what our take was on it. And here we are today with the Booker, yesterday, wasn't it? The Booker article about the levels, which confirmed what we were saying.
But now, I mean, let's put something in perspective here, because I'm sure that you probably shared a little bit of about your background with the locals, so that you stood a chance of not being dismissed as a rampant conspiracy theorist, because you are, in fact, you have in fact spent some time doing doctoral research into this subject, correct?
It's quite an interesting one. I started out at Reading University looking into energy load profiles under the guise of sustainability, climate change. That was the backstory to my research, Ian. And in the second year of my research, I started to unpick the data a little bit more in terms of climate change, and a lot of it just did not add up. And once you engage critical thinking, for me personally, it sounds quite banal, but not having access even to the IPCC's data to look at their models and how they were constructed, not having access to that data, to me, just rang alarm bells. And I thought, hang on a minute, if we have this planetary scale catastrophe, why don't they open source the data and let as many brains on the subject as possible and come up with some kind of solutions or options for solutions? But that wasn't the case.
In fact, sorry, David, am I correct? I think I'm correct in saying that Mike Mann has actually just been hauled through the Canadian courts because I think it was Professor Suzuki, wasn't it, that was demanding to see exactly the data that you've just been talking about. And despite the courts demanding that Mike Mann produce that data, he has thus far refused to do so.
And as backing up what you're saying, the famous Mann hockey stick has been seriously discredited over the past few years. Indeed, the whole climate change science itself has been unpicked many, many times. Of course, we've had the ClimateGate scandals, 1, 2. Not many people know that we've had a third ClimateGate scandal. Throughout history, we've had about, I think since 1400s, we've had about 20 periods of warming, 20 periods of cooling, and indeed the warmest year over the past century was in 1936, I believe. So the 1930s were warmer than they are now. And we've had periods in history where the CO2 levels have been between 3 and 10 times than that they are now. So many researchers also know that CO2 lags temperature change. So we first get temperature changes, and between 800 years and maybe 2,000 years, it appears, then we start to see changes in CO2. So that's just one part of the puzzle there that you can start to unpick in confirming that the two don't correlate. CO2 does not drive temperature change. There's a great presentation for those listeners who wish to spend an evening, perhaps. Don Easterbrook has put out some great information on this, and he talks about the true data, the data that hasn't been manipulated, and puts the pieces together quite well. And he holds a very convincing argument as to what has happened. How about they cherry pick the data, choosing weather stations in the warm locations, and all of the homogenizing processes. So again, once you go back again to the geopolitical documents, I think many a time you and I have trawled over the Club of Rome's first global revolution report, and of course it's been mentioned in Iron Mountain report as well in the 1960s. So once you engage the critical thinking, put your hat on and look around the subject a little bit, you soon come to the conclusion, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to do this, you come to the conclusion that it is probably the biggest hoax perpetrated on humanity, period.
So, I mean, obviously, you were following, well, as one would expect of an academic, epistemological integrity, and you weren't holding dear to any particular hypothesis, you were following the evidence. So as you started to unpick, where did your research take you?
Soon enough, I started looking into weather modification. I thought to myself, well, as you've just pointed out correctly, we've had extreme weather. We've had snow in Jerusalem. We've had, as you say, the forest fires. We've had extreme lightning storms. We've had flooding. 2012 in particular was a bad year for the UK with drought and flooding. And I decided, this can't be, there must be something in this. And if it's not climate change, then what is it? And I soon came across this term, weather modification, which led me then on to the science of geoengineering, which incidentally I will put on record that I believe it is a cover story actually for a lot of programs that are being perpetrated above our heads in the sky. But it's not conspiracy. It's not even opinion. The United Nations have now admitted on record, this is last year, that 42 countries are now actively engaged in weather modification programs. So that was a document that I've put out there in a couple of my recent talks. Interestingly, the US and the UK are not on the list of 42. However, NASA and NOAA openly state that the US are engaged in weather modification programs. Utility companies, for instance, modify weather, as do state government levels as well. So, again, once you start to put the pieces together, it took me into the geoengineering side of things. And for those of you who are still unfamiliar with geoengineering, it's defined as the deliberate intervention in the Earth's climate system in order to moderate climate change. So there's two parts of geoengineering. There's the solar radiation management part and the carbon dioxide reduction or sequestration part. So the spraying of the skies, the stratospheric aerosol injection, is supposedly to do with reflecting heat, solar radiation, sunlight back out into space through sulfur dioxide, mentioned in the Royal Society reports, and the UK House of Commons report in 2010, the regulation of geoengineering. And there was talk in 2010 by one of the head geoengineers, David Keith, about the use of aluminium oxide, Al2O3. Again, the reports are saying one thing, and the conferences outside of the reports are saying another thing. Now, I attended 3 of the 4 geoengineering public hearings last year. Now, these were in November and December. I think there was one in as well. That was by Professor John Shepherd, and the other 2 were by Professor David Keith. And Ian, bearing in mind this was a public, have the average number of people at the meetings?
Well, a lot depends on how well they were publicised, of course. But I know that you hosted an event in Bristol which had something like 200 plus people. So I'm guessing similar numbers.
I think we're probably looking at about 35 people. I'm not kidding. 35 people on average were at these geoengineering hearings, supposed geoengineering hearings for the public.
So in other words, they weren't advertised. Nobody was made aware of them.
Correct. They were advertised on the university websites. One of them was at Oxford, and the other one was at UCL, University College London. And there was no advertising beyond the university websites. I managed to get a couple of questions in to David Keith. I asked him, once the geoengineering programme was in full swing, what would we be likely to observe from a ground level? And his answer was quite interesting. He said, it depends how it's done, but you could either see nothing or you would see, something very vague. I also posed a question to him in Oxford by saying that, many people are now starting to see short-lived contrails as well as persistent contrails in the same airspace at the same time. I just want to unpick the contrail definition. A lot of people say, that's a contrail, that's a chemtrail. But indeed, some people know that chemtrails are also termed persistent contrails or persistent spreading contrails. And this bit gets a bit confusing. So NASA came out with a listing of contrail types, and there were 3 types, Ian. There was short-lived. So these are the ones that we've been used to for decades, that dissipate within about 30 seconds to 2 or 3 minutes. And then there's the persistent contrail and persistent spreading contrail. So the chemtrails that people are recognizing, chemical trails, are one of 2. They're the persistent or persistent spreading. So I'd just like to clear that up.
Well, now, I got to tell you that, I lived outside of the UK for the entire 1990s. And for part of the previous decade and part of the into the 2000s. And I have to say that I have absolutely no recollection whatsoever of seeing persistent contrails, for want of a better term, before I left the UK in the late 1980s. And when I lived in the Middle East, and again when I lived in Texas, in Houston, I remember very clearly the beautiful clear blue skies that we had for most of the year. Just the nature of the climates. And then when I came back to the UK in late 2001, that was really the first time that I started to notice something different about the skies. And at that time, I really had no clue what that was all about. And you've sent me a couple of pictures here, David, and I want to bring them up on the screen because I believe that this is from today in London. Is that correct?
I started the day with 4 phone calls before 8:30. And I was very pleased. The first one was at 7:45, and a chap from Sussex phoned me up and said, "David, have you seen the skies?" So I looked out the window, and many of you know I live in Dorset, and it was a total whiteout. But in London and in the southeast, these are the type of skies that people were reporting to me. It's probably one of the most significant spray days that we've seen for a while. Now, over Christmas time, we had a bit of a timeout, let's say. We had quite a few clear skies, and then by about the 6th or 7th of January this year, it started to pick up again. But today, these are the skies that people are reporting in the southeast.
And basically, what that means is that there is absolutely no direct sunlight. Obviously, what we should be looking at is a beautiful, crisp, clear winter sky. And in fact, what's happening is the sun is effectively being screened out completely. So any chance of topping up your vitamin D levels today in London was basically shot.
That's right. And by about midday, 1 o'clock, the sky started to clear a little bit in the southwest. And again, the trails were clearly seen, and I've been observing them up until about 5, 6 o'clock this evening. Now, I sent you 2 other photographs. Would it be possible to show the second photograph?
Yeah, that's coming up right now.
Okay.
Right, that's on screen.
Okay, so that was taken by myself. This was today at about 3 o'clock. What you can see just above the horizon are natural cumulus clouds. So they've got a slightly greyish tinge to them, and that's what they look like. They're observed what they look like when you've got that silvery grey behind. So a lot of days when people can't see the persistent contrails, but yet they can see this silvery haze and those slightly greyish cumulus clouds. This is what's been happening. So generally, that silvery grey is the particulates sprayed by the aircraft: aluminium oxide, barium sulfate, strontium. There's a whole host of chemicals, and I've noticed that the composition that they're spraying, they've been experimenting over the past 6 months with a different format, I think. Some of the contrails or persistent contrails that we've been seeing lately are a lot shorter. They're more dashed in appearance. They're big gaps in between them, and they appear to be dissipating within about 5 minutes to, let's say, quarter of an hour. Now, this is quite disconcerting for those people like myself who want to inform those who don't know about this. But if there's nothing visibly to inform or point people up into the sky, it's a little bit more difficult. But what's happening is these contrails dissipate, persistent contrails dissipate after about, say, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then about half an hour later, we start to see what appears to be wispy horsetail-like cirrus cloud, and then maybe half an hour after that, we start to see this haze. So there's a little bit of a game change there, which again is not great. But today in particular, they were using the traditional contrail types, with the contrails that span from horizon to horizon, that can actually be seen on satellite imagery. And if you'd like to fire up
there we go.
The last bit.
It's on screen now.
Great. So this is from NASA. And you can go onto NASA's website, and there's you can follow the links down to their satellite imagery. And this is showing a satellite image for today. And you can see Suffolk and Norfolk there poking out, and you can see this huge mist just to the east. And although the detail might not be resolute enough to see, but all across that band of cloud that runs from maybe just off the east coast of down to, let's say, Kent, within there, as you probably will be able to testify, there's probably in the region of about 200 persistent contrails just beyond the haze. So what we're seeing also is the HAARP frequencies in the cloud. So if you cast your eye maybe over Wales, over just to the north of Newcastle, we're seeing the type or ionospheric heating technology. You can see signatures in the cloud there.
So now you talked about HAARP. Let's now. This is. I'm going to bring it on screen now. This is the HAARP complex in Gakona in Alaska, and the HAARP stands for High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. So David, this is in Alaska. How is that having an impact on the northeast coast of the UK?
That's a good question. Well, HAARP came online in about 1998, 1999. The facility that we're looking at currently is the 3.6 megawatt capacity that came online in about 2006 active. But since then, there has been numerous HAARP-like facilities built and constructed across the world. Now, we know Russia, the UK, we've got a slightly scaled down version of this just outside Aberystwyth in Wales. There are HAARP facilities, I understand, in Germany and Israel. And what you can do is triangulate the frequencies. So think about it as a directional beam. So these are radio frequencies that operate at low frequency, and you can triangulate them to a certain portion of the ionosphere to get what they call a effective radiated power of about between 3 and 4 billion watts. So what that does is put up a block, what they call an omega block. So when the jet stream comes into contact with that block, it'll either have to go around it to the north or to the south. And in that way, you can start to steer the jet stream to a degree. And again, this isn't my opinion. The patents are out there to describe this. And there was, in fact, in 1999, a European Parliament report on the security. And in, I think, Annex B or Section B, it identifies HAARP as a technology to significantly alter climate patterns. So there are numerous references to HAARP within political literature, and obviously scientific.
David, you made the reference to obviously the Alaska facility, the one in Wales just outside Aberystwyth, and another one in Israel, and there's probably other scaled down arrays elsewhere. So is it your hypothesis that these are actually working in unison, and somebody is actually writing a script and determining how these arrays are used as a cohesive force, or are they counter, or is somebody trying to counter the output from another nation?
That question easily can be spun off into a big geopolitical debate, and we could go there. In fact, I personally believe, and this is just my personal opinion, that they are being orchestrated in concert with each other. So those operating HAARP-like facilities, and there are many HAARP-like facilities now. It's not just HAARP. HAARP indeed is fairly old now. It's aging. We now have what they call NexRad facilities. We have the SBX platforms, the sea-based X-band.
Oh, I think I've got one of those for you, coming up on the screen radar right now. This is what we're talking about, right?
That's right. So these are Doppler radar. These are huge. These can be drawn out to sea. They are self-powered, and they can be they're mobile. And indeed, during the recent earthquakes in the Southeast Asia, one of the SBX platforms was noted to be in the area. So I believe that these are being orchestrated, as I say, in concert. They're being used for weather manipulation. Now, I've heard a lot of talk recently of the ability to lock jet streams in place as well. So with the number of Tesla-type technology HAARP, let's say, installations, you can almost create certain points. Almost, you can think about it in lights of maybe a corridor system. So the jet stream will actually not deviate from certain points as it would naturally veer north or south, let's say. So there are three major jet streams, one in the northern hemisphere, one around the equator, and one in the southern hemisphere. And these are typically about 9 kilometers or so above ground level, and these carry the moisture content, essentially. So let's say, coming back to the United Nations admission of the 42 countries with active weather modification programs, what we do know is that there are hail suppression programs in operation. So Germany, for instance, is one of those countries mentioned in that report. So if hail suppression is being conducted in other parts of Europe, that's sequestering moisture in the atmosphere. So with an easterly wind, let's say, that moisture eventually has to give way at some point. And with the use of HAARP and other cloud seeding weather modification technologies, again, the Chinese have admitted in 2009 a couple of occasions in which they were modifying weather. One was for the 60th anniversary celebrations in Tiananmen Square, and the other one being the Beijing snowstorm in 2009. And the Olympics as well. Yes, yeah, the Olympics as well. So we've had numerous occasions in which countries have now actively said we are modifying weather. It is happening, and there will be, as the geoengineers themselves say, winners and losers in the game.
And let's look at some of the losers, because I want to look at a couple of events in particular in the US. Now, one is actually from 1992. And I remember this very well because I was based in the Middle East at the time, and I was still getting over my experiences of Kuwait in the aftermath of the first Gulf War. And I had an assistant working with me who was from Homestead in Florida. And of course, Homestead was assaulted by Hurricane Andrew in 1992. And what this young girl, she was at the time, reported was horrendous. I believe to this day the official death toll from Hurricane Andrew is listed as something like 15, but everybody in Florida, southern Florida, knows that it was a lot more. And in fact, the two main roads out of the Keys were blocked. And although people from Miami, the wealthy from Miami, were evacuated north up the Florida peninsula, the people in the Keys were effectively trapped. And a lot of the communities around Homestead, which was the epicenter of where the hurricane hit, were, at the lower end of the social spectrum. And of course, as you can see from this picture on screen here, it was totally devastated. Well, roll the clock forward 13 years, and we have a situation. Sorry, that's Homestead again. That's Homestead. That is also near Homestead. That's also Florida. But this is New Orleans. And of course, there has always been a lot of conjecture about Hurricane Andrew and the very unusual satellite signatures that were recorded, as it seemed to literally turn 90 degrees when it was off the coast of New Orleans in the Gulf of Mexico. And it turned 90 degrees and was literally appeared to be steered and directed right across New Orleans. And of course, the subsequent devastation and the effects of that are still being felt to this day, with many people, many residents from New Orleans still not able to return to their properties because they've effectively been fenced off. And of course, a lot of the land that has effectively been recovered was land that was owned or designated for the poorer elements of society. So there's a lot of speculation here that there was geoengineering with some geomanipulation going on here with these events.
And I'd just like to support what you're saying in as much as in 1962, Operation Storm Fury got underway. And Operation Storm Fury, for those of you who don't know, was to do with hurricane management, in as much as being able to steer hurricanes. They did a lot of development with intensifying hurricanes, but interestingly, also weakening hurricanes. So when you put the science together, you soon come to the realization that by the early 60s, mid-60s, that a lot of the technology and understanding in order to manage certain hurricane events were well understood. But then you apply your critical thinking and ask yourself, if these hurricanes are coming in off the Atlantic, and if they're known to have a trajectory to interfere with population zones, and we have the technology to weaken the hurricane and dissipate it, why aren't we?
Well, and that's a very good question, because, of course, in the past few weeks, this small island of ours has been absolutely battered. I mean, down here in the southwest right now, we're effectively cut off from the rest of the country. The rail network is severed. Right now, the rail network runs from London to Exeter, and then there's the break of some 20-odd miles and then the rail network starts again at Newton Abbot, so it runs from Newton Abbot down to Penzance. And it looks as though the rail line, which of course ran along the seafront at Dawlish, is not going to be repaired until around about Easter time. So, a big part of the country, the economy of the southwest is inevitably going to be impacted by this. And we've seen in the past. I mean, we can go into some sort of perhaps the realm of the less believable, but it was Hitler who wrote in Mein Kampf. He said, "The greater the crime perpetrated by the leadership, the less likely it is that the people will ever believe their leaders to be capable of perpetrating such an event." And I think it was Naomi Klein who coined the term disaster capitalism. But is it possible that perhaps what we're looking at now is an escalation of that? Because we know the world is descending into a corporatist hegemony, with the corporations effectively calling the shots, and one might argue a cabal of bankers and hydrocarbon executives above the generic corporatist group. But what we're looking at here is something that is inevitably going to benefit the few, those few who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom.
I think what you've just described then, I would wholeheartedly agree with. I'm also down in the southwest, and I know people that have been cut off from travelling. When you put into place Agenda 21 and the increased biodiversity areas, for instance, and what you just said then about the propagandist techniques being used, the bigger the lie, tell it often, but the bigger the lie, the more that people are likely to believe it. And, harping back to Orwell's 1984, black is white, white is black, war is peace, et cetera, et cetera. When you show people in black and white what is going on, a lot of people still don't believe you. So you could argue that the cyber that has been unleashed on humanity over the past few hundred years, if not thousands of years. I think Plato, 2,300 years ago, talks about a lot of social predictive programming techniques, and wasn't it the traveling theatres that
exactly.
He made the working class actually attend. They were obliged to attend certain plays, for instance, and these had sociological messages in them in order to steer culture. Wasn't that right?
Yeah, and then from sort of the 5th century, it became the church. Which is why it was a capital offence in this country to actually own a copy of the Bible up until about the 17th century. David, we're coming to the end of the show, and I have a feeling that we may actually have a lot more material to cover. In fact, I know we have a lot more material to cover. So, perhaps you would come back and join us, if not next week, then in a future show. But I just want to refer people, as I always say, don't take anything that we say at face value. You don't need to. The information is out there. You just have to have sufficient curiosity to go look for it. And a few years ago, The Ecologist ran an article under the title of Weather Warfare. Beware the US military's experiments with climatic warfare, says Professor Michel Chossudovsky of the University of Ottawa. Rarely acknowledged in the debate on global climate change, the world's weather can now be modified as part of a new generation of sophisticated electromagnetic weapons. Both the US and Russia have developed capabilities to manipulate the climate for military use. Well, those who are manipulating it for military use have obviously realized that if they manipulate it for corporatist use, they can actually make a lot more money without actually necessarily going into overt warfare. Now, David, you are going to join us at the AV5 event later this year. David's going to be one of our speakers at AV5, which is going to be held at the Staverton Park Hotel, right in the heart of England, over the weekend of May the 16th through to Monday the 19th. More information there on www.alternativeview.co.uk. This is Ian R. Crane with Humanity versus Insanity. Join me at 9 o'clock for Fracking Nightmare.